On an autumn night in 2023, the air above the Gobi Desert was clear and brutally cold. Inside a low, windowless building on the edge of the Jiuquan launch complex, a Chinese tracking station watched the sky in silence. Banks of monitors showed the usual pattern of dots and numbers. Telemetry from Beidou navigation satellites, fragments of old rocket stages, and one small experimental spacecraft, catalogued in the West as Object 56921. Then, for exactly 32 seconds, Object 5692's Vulcan stopped existing. On Chinese screens, nothing obvious happened. The ground controllers still had their internal data feed. But on multiple international tracking feeds, from US Space Force sensors to European radar networks, the satellite's transponder signal vanished. Its predicted orbit no longer matched reality. The algorithms that quietly keep a catalogue of everything up there suddenly had a hole. 3 days later, in Colorado Springs, Dr. Elena Markov, a former US Air Force orbital analyst who now works in commercial space situational awareness, got a message that made her pause. A colleague in Europe sent a short note and a file. Look at this pass over the Gobi, time-stamped to the millisecond. So they wondered what could cause this. The raw tracking data showed a subtle but undeniable deviation. The satellite's position, inferred from radar and radio, jumped several hundred meters off its expected path in just a few seconds. That might sound small, but in orbital mechanics it was a sharp twitch, the kind associated with a deliberate maneuver. So maybe that was it, a routine thruster burn, a test of new propulsion hardware. But they realized that explanation didn't work. There was no corresponding plume signature in infrared surveillance data. The change in velocity implied by the orbit shift did not match the performance of any known chemical or electric system on a craft that size. For a moment, the satellite appeared to accelerate in a way that, on paper, required more propellant than it could possibly carry. At the same time, radio telescopes that monitor the crowded L-band reported a brief, narrow disruption near protected navigation frequencies. It was not a blaring, obvious jammer, more a knife edge of interference that slid across their receivers as the satellite passed overhead. The source pointed back to the same patch of sky. So what was causing this? If a major space power can shift an asset in orbit without leaving a clean trail in the public data, it means more than clever engineering. It means a spacecraft could approach another nation's satellite with almost no warning. It means navigation signals from systems such as GPS or Beidou could be bent, drowned, or quietly spoofed, while ground users blame their phones, not a platform 1,200 kilometers up. For Dr. Markov, the anomaly over the Gobi was not just a curiosity. It was a hint that China's most interesting spacecraft might be the ones it barely mentions, the ones whose signals flicker at the edge of detection, which left them with just one question. What exactly is China building in space? And why does so much of it seem designed to disappear? For a long time, that question hovered in the background of other people's work. Then, around 2013, something subtle started to show up in their data. Independent satellite trackers in Europe, amateur astronomers in Australia, and a few very quiet government analysts began comparing notes on Chinese spacecraft that had done one very strange thing. They had disappeared, not from orbit, but from the record. Step by step, the process was almost boring. Someone would log a new Chinese launch, low-key press release, vague mission description about technology verification or space environment monitoring, one more line on an already crowded manifest. Orbital elements would appear in public catalogues. The satellite would behave normally for weeks, sometimes months. Then suddenly, its radio signal would go dark for hours, or its tracking data would stop matching the published orbit. So they wondered what could cause this. Maybe it was just routine station keeping, or a temporary power issue. So maybe that was it. A glitch, a mispointed antenna, nothing more. But they realized that explanation didn't work. When the satellite reappeared, its orbit had changed in ways that were anything but routine. The first surprising observations came from those changes. Repeatedly, Chinese satellites were seen making close approaches to dead spacecraft, defunct weather satellites, spent upper stages, even fragments from China's own 2007 anti-satellite test. Their inclination would shift by a degree or two, enough to move them into a new orbital plane, and then on cue, another Chinese platform in a nearby orbit would execute a synchronized maneuver. One object nudged higher, another slightly lower, both adjusting just enough to raise eyebrows at tracking stations. By the mid-2010s, the pattern was no longer anecdotal. Researchers counted dozens of suspicious events since around 2013, depending on how strict the definition was. Some catalogs list more than 100 discrete maneuvers that did not match the stated missions. On average, every few months, another Chinese satellite would go quiet, slide sideways in inclination, or sidle up to a derelict object. And again, the timing lined up with something happening on Earth. A major US-China naval exercise, a missile defense test, a flare-up in the South China Sea. Again and again, the pattern was the same. Low-key launch, vague mission description, then months later, odd behavior in orbit that did not fit the official story. Again and again, the same handful of platforms showed up near high-value targets. Foreign communications satellites, early warning birds, even the orbital paths used by GPS and China's own Beidou navigation system. For anyone watching closely, it suggested that each quiet line in a launch manifest might be doing more than testing a sensor. Behind those bland names could be spacecraft practicing how to inspect, shadow, or even interfere with other satellites. And if a satellite can reach another country's navigation or communication system, it can, in principle, reach the systems that feed your GPS, your satellite internet, even the power grid that keeps your lights on. So what was causing this? Was it just aggressive research, or rehearsal for something far more disruptive in a crisis? The next set of maneuvers would offer a clue, because the Chinese satellites stopped only visiting dead spacecraft and started doing something far bolder. Those bolder moves only make sense when the camera pulls back. Imagine the view, not from a ground station, but from a virtual globe, slowly spinning in the dark. Every Chinese satellite is highlighted. At first, the pattern seems regional. Dense clusters of points hanging over East Asia, tracing bright arcs over the South China Sea, the Korean Peninsula, the long coastline from Shanghai to Hainan. So maybe that was it, just a concentrated belt of surveillance and communications over China's immediate neighborhood. But they realized that explanation didn't work. As the globe turns, more tracks appear, sweeping down across the Indian Ocean, over Africa's resource corridors, and along key sea lanes from the Strait of Malacca through the Red Sea and up into the Mediterranean. The density thickens over shipping choke points and energy routes, as if someone has taken a highlighter to the arteries of global trade. Then the altitude changes. Drop the camera into low Earth orbit and bands of satellites crowd into view. Imaging spacecraft, weather platforms, experimental test beds, and those inspection vehicles that have been sidling up to other nations' hardware. It looks less like a few isolated objects, and more like a scaffolding of watchtowers circling the planet every 90 minutes. Push higher, into medium orbit, and the structure changes again. Here, the Beidou navigation constellation forms carefully spaced rings around Earth. each satellite broadcasting timing and positioning signals that mirror the role of GPS. So they wondered what could cause this level of coverage to grow so fast. The answer sits right in the data. By 2020, Beidou had reached full global service, giving Beijing an independent navigation backbone for both civilian logistics and military targeting. Higher still, at geostationary altitude, the scene settles into a slow, deliberate geometry. Chinese communications platforms occupy orbital slots over Asia, Africa, and the Atlantic, hanging over the same point on Earth's surface, day after day. From here, the network resembles a system of invisible highways and toll booths, relaying signals, television, encrypted command links. Viewed together, the effect is eerie. China's presence in orbit is not a random scatter of metal. It is a slowly brightening constellation, wrapping itself around the planet. And those lines in the sky map directly onto the ground. Certain low-orbit passes cut right over major US bases in the Pacific, from Guam to Okinawa. Others time their sweeps across the Strait of Malacca, the Bab el-Mandeb, and the Suez approaches, watching the narrow straits where tankers and container ships can be most easily delayed. Still more tracks hug the Himalayas, revisiting potential flashpoints along the India-China border with metronomic regularity. The implication is hard to ignore. This isn't just a race to launch more satellites. It is a contest over the most valuable real estate in space, which left them with just one question. Who will end up owning the high ground the rest of the world now depends on? On paper, the answer sounds reassuring. Ask Chinese officials who will own that high ground, and the response is almost always the same. No one. Because, they say, space is for peaceful development and shared progress. In speeches, white papers, and state media segments, the narrative is remarkably consistent. The space program is framed as a peaceful use of outer space, focused on scientific exploration, international cooperation, and economic development. Footage shows schoolchildren watching launches, not soldiers. Commentators talk about weather forecasting, precision agriculture, and communications for remote villages, not targeting data or missile warning. And some of that is very real. China's high-resolution Earth observation satellites do help monitor crops and water use, tracking droughts before they become food crises. Disaster monitoring constellations beam back data on floods, earthquakes, and typhoons, giving local officials precious hours to move people out of harm's way. On the Tiangong space station, crews run experiments on fluid physics, medicine, and materials science in microgravity, the kind of work that shows up in peer-reviewed journals, not classified briefings. So maybe that was it. Just another major power repeating the standard space-age story. Science first, everything else second. A space policy expert interviewed for this investigation points out that this is not unique. From the early Cold War to the present, the United States, Russia, and Europe all anchor their official language in peaceful purposes and cooperation. It is the diplomatic baseline, the script everyone reads from in public, even as military planners quietly write a different set of notes in the background. But they realized that explanation didn't work once they started tracking the details. Sitting behind the glossy videos are missions described in strangely vague terms, with payloads labeled as technology demonstrators or space environment experiments that later show up in Western defense reports as having clear military utility. One satellite tests rendezvous and proximity operations with another, then quietly practices the same maneuvers that an inspector or anti-satellite vehicle would need. Launch announcements sometimes land with very little technical detail. A rocket lifts off from Jiuquan or Xichang. State media mentions a new experimental satellite, and that is it. No precise orbit, no payload mass, no clear mission description. Tracking stations abroad watch the object's signal, plot its trajectory, and notice a pattern. The orbit happens to give perfect coverage of foreign naval routes or passes repeatedly over missile fields. Here is the pattern interrupt. In public, Tiangong is a symbol of peaceful science. In internal planning documents, Chinese strategists openly describe space as a new warfighting domain. Both statements can be true at the same time. So what was causing this gap between words and behavior? The data suggest that the science is genuine, but it may be only one layer. Underneath sits a more complex strategy, where every peaceful satellite, every benign-sounding experiment is also a node in a wider system of power projection in orbit that the rest of the world is only beginning to map. So that raises the uncomfortable question. If every peaceful satellite can also be a node in a power system, what kind of system is China actually building in orbit? Because no country, not even a rising superpower with record launch rates, can do everything. Rockets, stations, deep space probes, constellations for navigation and surveillance. Each one consumes launch mass, budget, and time. Every mission to Mars is a mission not flown for reconnaissance. Every heavy module sent to low Earth orbit is a satellite that did not become part of a dense communications web. So they wondered what could cause this particular pattern in China's choices. Start with the hard physical constraints: launch cadence and payload to orbit. China now flies dozens of rockets a year, but its heaviest vehicles still cannot casually throw around US-style super-heavy payloads. That forces trade-offs. Put up a multi-module space station, and a significant slice of that cadence is locked for years. Build a global navigation system, and hundreds of medium satellites must be launched and constantly replenished. Yet in the data, some priorities are unmistakable. Beidou, China's navigation system, reached global coverage in 2020. That meant dozens of launches committed over 2 decades just to ensure that, in a crisis, Chinese ships, aircraft, and missiles do not depend on GPS. In parallel, commercial imaging catalogs show a rapid thickening of Chinese reconnaissance constellations, optical, radar, electronic intelligence, passing over key maritime choke points and US bases several times a day. So maybe that was it, a narrow focus on military positioning and surveillance. But they realized that explanation didn't work, because at the same time, China chose to spend enormous mass and launch capacity on Tiangong, a modular space station designed for at least a decade of continuous human presence. This was not the cheap option. Beijing could have joined the ISS years ago, or simply flown occasional crewed test flights. Instead, it built an independent outpost with its own life support, its own docking systems, its own experiment racks. To understand what that means, it helps to compare with earlier space powers. During the Cold War, the United States poured effort into GPS and secure military communications satellites, the backbone of precision warfare and global command. The Soviet Union, and later Russia, leaned heavily into crewed stations and missile early warning satellites, but never fielded a full civilian-grade navigation system until much later. Each architecture reflected what its builders feared most and how they planned to fight. China's pattern looks different. Beidou for navigation, growing communications and data relay networks, expanding imaging constellations, a permanent station for human presence and microgravity research. Well, there is one known source of that combination in the historical record: the template of a full-spectrum space infrastructure, able to operate even if cut off from US-led systems, and in some domains to rival or outflank them, which leaves them with just one question: how far is Beijing willing to go to protect or weaponize that new architecture when it is challenged? So if China has built this full-spectrum space architecture, and if something is clearly pressing against it, The next question is obvious. Could nature be to blame before anyone points to a human hand? Well, there is one known source of large-scale, unpredictable interference in orbit: the Sun. Solar storms and what scientists call space weather can be brutal. When a burst of charged particles from a solar flare or coronal mass ejection slams into Earth's magnetic field, it can rattle satellites, distort radio signals, and push delicate orbits around. To a ground controller watching telemetry, a stable spacecraft can suddenly look as if it is drifting, misbehaving, or even briefly vanishing from contact. In February 2022, SpaceX lost around 40 newly launched Starlink satellites in a single event. A geomagnetic storm puffed up the upper atmosphere, increased drag, and quietly pulled the spacecraft down until they re-entered. A year later, a strong solar storm triggered auroras far beyond their usual latitudes and forced operators worldwide to switch to backup communication modes. The pattern was familiar. Gradual buildup, global footprint, hours of degraded performance, and multiple countries' assets all affected at once. So maybe that was it, some analysts thought when they first saw Chinese satellites flicker, nudge, and reset. The timing looked tempting. Solar activity has been ramping up toward a peak, and space weather forecasts did show elevated conditions on several of the days in question. So they wondered what could cause this, if not a storm washing across low Earth orbit. But they realized that explanation didn't work. When researchers laid the solar data over the anomaly timelines, the mismatch jumped out. Typically, solar interference hits broad swaths of orbit and many operators at once. Here, the disruptions were sharply localized in time and limited to specific Chinese satellites. Neighboring spacecraft from Europe, the US, and commercial firms in nearly identical orbits kept reporting clean, stable signals, while a handful of Chinese platforms showed abrupt attitude tweaks or unexplained mode changes. Typically, space weather effects track the sun's rhythm. They rise and fall with the 11-year solar cycle and with the geometry of Earth's magnetic field. Here, the pattern was different. The odd behavior clustered around particular orbital shells, longitudes, and overflight windows, not around the peaks of solar flux. The same satellite would pass through the same region again days later under similar space weather conditions and behave perfectly. So, what was causing this? The final nail in the coffin came from ground stations that monitor both ionospheric conditions and satellite telemetry. During several of the most dramatic Chinese anomalies, the ionosphere was quiet, geomagnetic indices were low, and other nations' satellites in the same volume of space showed no sign of solar-driven disruption. The environment looked normal. Only the Chinese assets were acting as if an invisible hand had nudged them. That leaves an uncomfortable conclusion. If nature is not the source, then the behavior is almost certainly intentional and therefore strategic. But whose strategy is it? And what exactly are they rehearsing in those thin layers of orbit above our heads? So if the environment is quiet, the sun is calm, and only a specific cluster of Chinese satellites keeps twitching at the same moments, the pattern starts to look less like noise and more like handwriting. The anomalies are too targeted to be natural, too consistent to be random, and far too expensive to be throwaway engineering tests. Look at what has been stitched together so far. Repeated maneuvers in tight orbital shells, synchronized attitude changes during known periods of GPS and Beidou interference, and behavior that lines up with sensitive regions on the ground, rather than with scientific opportunities in space. So maybe that was it, a string of unconnected experiments by overcautious operators. But they realized that explanation didn't work. The data kept snapping back to the same conclusion. The only thing that fits is this. A significant portion of China's space infrastructure has been designed from day one with dual use in mind. On paper, these are weather images, communications relays, and navigation satellites. In practice, the same hardware can support precision missile guidance, real-time targeting, and electronic warfare rehearsals. Well, there is one known source of that kind of mindset, a military that has been told to treat space as a warfighting domain, not a sanctuary. That leaves a sharper question. Are these primarily peaceful systems that just happen to carry military utility in the background, the way any navigation network can be used by both cargo ships and warships? Or are they military platforms first, wrapped in civilian language, public outreach, and a thin layer of scientific experiments to make everything look normal from the outside? So, what was causing this dual personality to become so pronounced? Consider the trajectory. China now launches more rockets per year than any other country. Its Beidou navigation system reached global coverage in 2020, giving it an independent alternative to GPS. It has a permanent Tiangong station in orbit and plans a joint lunar base in the 2030s. If a rising superpower is quietly building the most flexible, maneuverable, and resilient satellite network ever put in orbit, the world has never seen this exact configuration of power before. And this is not an abstract, distant chess game. Those timing signals that let container ships thread narrow straits at night. They come from constellations that can be nudged, jammed, or selectively denied. The imagery that helps insurers price flood risks, that guides tractors in precision agriculture, that keeps tankers from drifting onto reefs, depends on satellites whose owners decide who gets clean data and who gets noise. So the stakes reach all the way down into pockets and ports. This is about who can, in a crisis, reach into your phone, your harbor, your airspace, and quietly tilt the balance by turning the sky on or off, one signal at a time, which left them with just one question: how intentional is that leverage? So before going further into jamming and mysterious interference, there's one quiet misunderstanding that has to be cleared up, because it sits under almost every part of this story. When people say GPS, they usually mean the thing in my phone that tells me where I am. But technically, that's not quite right. GPS, strictly speaking, is one specific system, the American Global Positioning System, run by the US Space Force. It is a constellation of medium Earth orbit satellites, plus a global network of ground stations and control centers, all working together to broadcast precise timing and navigation signals. It was built for the US military, then opened to the world. And it is not alone. There is Russia's GLONASS, restored and expanded after the Cold War. There is Europe's Galileo, designed to give the EU its own independent navigation backbone. And there is China's Beidou, which reached full global coverage in 2020 and now fields dozens of satellites across several orbital planes. Each system has its own frequencies, its own control segment, its own political master. So what was causing this confusion where everything gets called GPS? The answer is in your pocket. Modern smartphones do not care about national branding. They care about signal strength and geometry. A typical handset quietly listens to multiple constellations at once: GPS, Galileo, Beidou, and often GLONASS too. The receiver just sees more satellites in more directions, which means better accuracy in city streets, faster lock-on when stepping out of the subway, and more resilience when some signals are weak or noisy. Engineers have a clean term for all of these systems together: GNSS, Global Navigation Satellite System. GNSS is not one network, but any space-based system that beams precise time and position data to receivers on Earth. If it has navigation satellites, ground control stations, and timing signals that let a device compute its location, it lives under that GNSS umbrella. This is where the stakes start to sharpen. Because once navigation becomes GNSS instead of just GPS, it becomes a geopolitical map. The US runs GPS, Russia runs GLONASS, Europe runs Galileo, China runs Beidou, and those signals are now baked into shipping routes, aviation procedures, financial networks, power grid timing, and the tiny chipsets inside mass-market phones. So maybe that was it, the quiet leverage hidden in everyday convenience. If China controls one of the major GNSS backbones, and Beidou support is now standard in cars, drones, and smartphones around the world, then in a crisis, what choices does that create? Could access be degraded regionally? Could timing be skewed subtly rather than switched off? Well, there is one known source of leverage in any GNSS. Whoever owns the satellites and ground stations decides the rules. And that leads straight to an uncomfortable question the next section has to confront. How much of Beidou is about navigation, and how much is about power projection in orbit and on Earth? To understand why that question matters so much to China, the story has to jump back half a century to a very different kind of bet on space. In the early 1970s, deep inside the US military bureaucracy, a small group of officers and engineers was pushing an idea that sounded almost absurd for its time: using satellites to steer weapons. At that point, navigation from orbit was crude. Systems like transit could tell a submarine where it was, but only every few minutes, and only after long calculations. Hitting a moving target from the air with help from space? That felt closer to science fiction than to a funded program. So maybe that was it. A neat lab concept that would never survive contact with budgets and bomber crews. Inside the emerging GPS program, though, an internal slogan began to circulate. The ambition was simple to state and terrifying to contemplate. Drop 5 bombs into the same hole. Not roughly on the same target. The same hole. Turn what had been area bombing into something approaching surgery. So they wondered what could cause this level of precision. The answer on paper was elegant. If a receiver in an aircraft could read timing signals from multiple satellites, solve for its position in real time, and feed that data straight into a guidance computer, then the bomb's trajectory could be corrected all the way down. On the whiteboard, the math worked. The question was whether the hardware would. Picture the test range. A remote desert. Heat shimmer on the horizon. A chalked cross on cracked Earth that might as well be the center of the universe for a few hours. Overhead, a bomber carries an early GPS prototype. A metal box bristling with cables and antennas that, to a casual observer, does not look ready to reshape warfare. In a nearby blockhouse, engineers crowd around radar scopes and downlink terminals, watching raw data stream in. Any unexpected interference, any glitch in the signal, and the bomb will drift wide. The first release is almost painfully ordinary. Bomb away, a distant thump, dust rising. But then the second lands so close the craters overlap. The third deepens the same wound in the ground. By the time the pattern is obvious, the room is very quiet. The test has done something more dangerous than fail spectacularly. It has worked. GPS begins to shift in that moment from an exotic aid to a core military capability, and later, as the constellation grows, into a civilian utility quietly given away to the world. However, that giveaway came with a catch. The United States controlled the satellites and the ground stations and could degrade or deny the signal at will. Other countries noticed. So what was causing this sense of unease in Beijing as GPS reshaped both warfare and commerce? Well, there is one known source of strategic anxiety for any rising power: dependence. China watched those bomb craters in the desert, at first through second-hand reports and later with its own satellites, and drew a hard conclusion. It would never again let its military aim, move, or fight based on someone else's timing signal. But how do you build a rival to GPS without triggering a confrontation in orbit? And what happens when your version is designed from day one with electronic warfare in mind? For Chinese planners, the answer started to take shape in the 1990s in a place very far from Beijing. In 1991, during the Gulf War, US warplanes and cruise missiles threaded through Iraqi air defenses and hit targets with eerie precision. On Chinese screens, those grainy news clips and later intelligence footage showed something unsettling. This was not just better piloting. This was a different kind of warfare, anchored on a timing signal from space. Analysts dug into the data. GPS-guided bombs consistently landing within meters of their aim points. Armored columns navigating at night through featureless desert. Ships and aircraft moving in tight, coordinated patterns. The contrast with China's own capabilities at the time was brutal. Its forces still relied on maps, compasses and radio beacons that could be jammed or misread. So they wondered, what could cause this? The answer kept coming back to the same invisible infrastructure, the US Global Positioning System. Then a deeper concern emerged. GPS was not a neutral global utility. It was a US military system with a civilian service that could be degraded at will. In Beijing, a chilling scenario took hold. In a crisis over Taiwan or a confrontation in the South China Sea, what if GPS access for China's region was suddenly dialed down or cut off entirely? So maybe that was it. A quiet lever of pressure built into every satellite receiver on Chinese soil. But they realized that explanation didn't work, because there was no technical fix that could make foreign control disappear from a foreign system. The only way to remove that vulnerability was to build another constellation. So what was causing this sense of urgency was not just envy of US precision, but the realization that depending on GPS meant accepting a strategic kill switch. The response became Beidou. First launched in the early 2000s, it began modestly. A handful of satellites providing regional coverage and experimental services over China and nearby waters. Over the next 2 decades, the pattern was relentless. More launches, more orbital planes, more ground stations. By 2012, Beidou covered the Asia-Pacific. By 2020, after dozens of rockets and billions of dollars, it reached full global coverage, a true peer to GPS in sheer reach. Technically, Beidou was built with dual audiences from day one. Civilian users get open signals for navigation, tracking, smartphones, and finance. Military users get encrypted channels, higher power, and regional augmentation that sharpens accuracy over the Western Pacific. Those signals now feed Chinese cruise missiles, drones, artillery, and logistics networks. Well, there is one known source that all of that depends on. A dense mesh of Chinese satellites broadcasting timing and positioning with enough redundancy to survive interference and attack. In the end, Beidou is not just a copy pasted from GPS blueprints. It is a geopolitical insurance policy, a guarantee that China's economy and armed forces will not be held hostage to someone else's satellites. But once 2 rival constellations exist, another question appears. What happens when they start treating each other's signals as potential targets? That question isn't theoretical anymore because Beidou has already slipped past the realm of missiles and war plans into something far more mundane. Your commute, your online shopping, even the timing of your bank transfers. In China, most people never switch on Beidou. They don't have to. Open a mapping app on a mainstream Chinese smartphone, get into a new electric car, or scan a QR code on a parcel in a logistics hub, and Beidou signals are already in the background. The chipset in the phone is listening to GPS, GLONASS, Galileo and Beidou together, then quietly fusing that data. So maybe that was it, just another checkbox on a spec sheet. But they realized that explanation didn't work. Because Beidou isn't just one more constellation in the list. In Chinese-built ride-hailing platforms, truck dispatch systems, and railway scheduling centers, Beidou is the default source of truth. Container ships use it to thread narrow approaches into ports from Shanghai to Piraeus. Surveyors use it to lay out high-speed rail lines with centimeter precision. Delivery scooters in crowded megacities rely on it to navigate alleys where street names barely matter. If those signals vanish, the disruption doesn't stay in orbit. It ripples through traffic jams, missed cargo slots, and delayed factory runs. Then there are the sectors where timing is everything. Power grid operators use Beidou to synchronize phase angles across distant substations so that a surge in one province doesn't cascade into a blackout in another. Financial trading systems timestamp transactions to the microsecond, anchored to satellite time. Telecom networks align base stations so that wireless channels don't bleed into each other and cause interference. So what was causing this dependence? A deliberate effort. Beijing has pushed Beidou into every layer where precise time and position equal economic leverage. And it doesn't stop at China's borders. Many of the cheapest GNSS chipsets on the global market now arrive multi-constellation ready by default. A farmer in Kenya using a low-cost guidance unit on a tractor, a trucking company in Pakistan tracking cargo, a smartphone user in Brazil checking rideshare arrival times. All may be drawing on Beidou signals without ever seeing the name on screen. The pattern is simple. If the satellite is overhead and the signal is strong, the receiver uses it. Well, there is one known source helping to spread that reach even further: the Belt and Road Initiative. As China finances ports, railways, and industrial parks across Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, it also offers Beidou ground stations, augmentation networks, and training packages. Partner governments get glossy promises of navigation sovereignty and digital Silk Roads. Chinese companies get long-term contracts to maintain the infrastructure, which left them with just one question. If Beidou becomes the quiet backbone of global supply chains, what happens in the next serious political crisis when space itself is on the table and navigation signals are no longer just a service but a bargaining chip? And that bargaining chip is not just a signal in the radio spectrum. It is now a physical object, the size of a bus, circling overhead. Because while Beidou quietly threads through shipping lanes and phone towers, China has also built something far more visible: Tiangong, its own space station, in low Earth orbit about 400 kilometers up. It is modular, 3 main sections in a T-shape, with docking ports ready for additional cargo ships, crewed spacecraft, and future expansion. In practical terms, it can host 3 astronauts for months at a time, entirely independent of the International Space Station. On paper, Tiangong is exactly what it looks like: a national science lab in space. Inside, racks are filled with experiment cabinets. Fluids are pushed through transparent channels to study how they mix without gravity. Alloys are melted and cooled to test new materials for turbines and electronics. Astronauts draw their own blood to study bone loss and immune response. And they grow cells and small organisms to watch how biology rewires itself when the usual up and down signal disappears. So maybe that was it, a straightforward story of a latecomer catching up. The United States and Russia had long-duration stations. Europe and Japan had modules on the ISS. China wanted a seat at the same table, so it built its own table. But they realized that explanation didn't work for everyone following the data. Because any large, crewed platform in low Earth orbit is not just a lab. It is also a vantage point. Cameras on Tiangong can point down as easily as they point at a test tube. Radar or optical sensors mounted there could watch missile fields, naval task forces, or other satellites with very little interference from the atmosphere. So they wondered what could cause this shift in perception among analysts. Part of it is geometry. Tiangong's orbit is inclined roughly 41 to 43 degrees, which means, over time, it passes over most of China, the Western Pacific, the Indian Ocean, and large stretches of the Middle East and Africa. Those ground tracks line up uncomfortably well with key shipping lanes, US bases, and regions where China already flies surveillance satellites. Look at the pattern of its passes. Several times a day over the same broad bands of latitude, complementing the fixed, predictable orbits of China's existing imaging constellations. From that altitude, wide-angle instruments could scan huge swaths of Earth on each orbit, while more precise sensors could track other spacecraft, testing proximity operations or rendezvous procedures under the banner of station safety. Well, there is one known source of reassurance. Almost every space agency insists their stations are peaceful, but hardware is agnostic. The same robotic arm that captures a cargo ship can practice approaching another satellite. The same navigation data that keeps Tiangong stable can train algorithms for future inspector craft. So what was causing this growing unease? It was the sense that Tiangong might be more than a ticket into the club of advanced spacefaring nations, that it could be the first visible module of a wider architecture, a test bed for cislunar ambitions and space-based leverage in the next crisis. And if that is true, then Tiangong is not the end of the story at all, but the opening move, which raises a much sharper question about what China plans to put in orbit next. And to understand what that next might be, it helps to rewind to a moment when China showed the world, very bluntly, what it was willing to do in orbit. In January 2007, at a remote test site in Sichuan, a single missile rose into the night. Its target was not an enemy launch pad or an aircraft carrier. It was a dead weather satellite, Fengyun 1C, circling Earth in low orbit, about 860 kilometers up. The interceptor raced into space, homed in on the satellite, and hit it head-on at several kilometers per second. There was no warhead. The kinetic energy alone was enough. Radar stations in the United States and elsewhere watched the aftermath. The single point of light that had been Fengyun 1C suddenly fractured into a swarm. Over the next days, tracking data showed more than 3,000 catalogued fragments, each big enough to destroy another satellite on impact. And that was only what sensors could see. Models suggested tens of thousands of smaller shards, down to the size of a screw or paint chip, spreading into a diffuse shell around the planet. So maybe that was it? Some argued at first, an unfortunate but contained test. But they realized that explanation didn't work. Many of those fragments were lofted into orbits that will stay crowded for decades. Every piece is a bullet with no guidance system, crossing the paths of weather satellites, imaging constellations, even parts of the International Space Station's orbit. The interference here is physical, not electromagnetic, but the effect is similar. Sudden, unpredictable disruption for anything unlucky enough to be in the way. The global reaction was swift. In Washington, officials condemned the test as irresponsible and destabilizing. European space agencies ran their own simulations and quietly adjusted flight plans. Analysts in Japan, India, and elsewhere saw something more than a demonstration of raw technology. They saw a signal that China now had the ability to blind or cripple satellites in wartime, including GPS, communications relays, and early warning systems that nuclear deterrence depends on. This is where a broader question comes in. Space, especially low Earth orbit, functions as a shared commons. One country's debris does not stay politely above its own territory. It spreads, precesses, and drifts, endangering everyone's assets, including China's growing Beidou navigation system and its own imaging and relay fleets. So what was causing this apparent willingness to foul an environment Beijing clearly planned to use more and more? Well, There is one known source of leverage in space warfare: the ability to threaten satellites physically while keeping one's own relatively safe. Kinetic anti-satellite weapons are the bluntest tool for that. They are also the messiest. And after 2007, something in China's pattern changed. Later tests were higher, less destructive, or framed as missile defense. Suspected co-orbital systems maneuvered quietly without visible clouds of fragments, which left them with just one question. If the most dramatic tests stopped leaving obvious debris in public tracking data, what exactly was China rehearsing in the shadows of orbit? The answer many analysts arrived at was uncomfortable. Perhaps China was rehearsing space weapons that were designed not to be seen at all. Instead of a missile streaking up from the atmosphere, imagine this: a satellite already in orbit, slowly adjusting its path, sidling up to another spacecraft until they are only tens of meters apart. No explosion, no flash. Just two dots on a tracking screen that, from the ground, almost overlap. That is the basic idea of a co-orbital anti-satellite system. In theory, once it gets that close, the options multiply. It could extend a mechanical arm and nudge a target just enough to send it tumbling. It could fire a small thruster plume into delicate sensors. It could carry a radio payload that quietly overwhelms the target's receiver, or a device that clamps on and drains power. The key is the same in every case. From a distance, it looks like routine proximity operations. So they wondered what could cause this kind of concern in the first place. One answer kept showing up in Western reports: China's Shijian series. In 2013, Shijian 15 performed unusual rendezvous and proximity maneuvers with another Chinese satellite, Shijian 7. The public explanation emphasized space debris inspection and servicing experiments. So maybe that was it, a benign test of future repair robots. But they realized that explanation didn't work. The orbits, the repeated close approaches, and the precision of the maneuvers looked very similar to what a co-orbital ASAT rehearsal would require. US military briefings quietly flagged Shijian 15 and later Chinese satellites as potential inspection or offensive platforms. The technology is dual use by design. The same capability that can refuel or deorbit a dead spacecraft can just as easily disable a live one. Then there is the other battlefield in space that never touches hardware at all: the invisible realm of code and radio waves. Modern satellites depend on ground stations, uplink commands, and downlink data. If an attacker can hack the control network, spoof authentication, or flood the command channel with fake signals, a satellite can be turned off, mispointed, or even told to fire its own thrusters at the wrong time. So what was causing this new anxiety in Western intelligence? Public assessments from the US and its allies now describe China as developing a full suite of counter-space tools: reversible jamming that blinds sensors without permanent damage, cyber operations against ground infrastructure, and more destructive options that still avoid creating debris. Well, there is one known source of such concern: capabilities that can be used, denied, and never clearly proven in public. In that sense, the most dangerous space weapons may not be the ones that show up in dramatic test videos. They are the quiet systems that can make a satellite go blind, deaf, or simply vanish from the network, leaving only a gap in the signal and a line in a classified incident report, which left them with just one question: how do you deter a weapon you can barely even see? So what was causing this? In Pentagon briefings and Space Force hearings, one phrase kept showing up in the classified slides and then, cautiously in public testimony: China is the pacing threat. Not the biggest enemy in some abstract sense, but the competitor whose speed and sophistication set the tempo. In other words, if Beijing moves faster in orbit, Washington has to speed up just to keep from falling behind. In military planning, That term has a very specific meaning. The pacing threat is the benchmark. It is the force whose capabilities, launch rate, and innovation become the reference signal for budgets, training, and war games. So maybe that was it, a bureaucratic label that sounded scarier than it was. But they realized that explanation didn't work. Because when senior US Space Force officers spoke in public, the pattern was striking. Again and again, generals responsible for space operations said the quiet part out loud. China, not Russia, is the main concern in orbit. They pointed to a rapid increase in Chinese launches, an integrated civil-military strategy, and a clear plan to use space for information dominance. One commander described China's buildup as breathtaking in scope and scale. Another warned that Beijing is moving at twice our speed in some areas. The data, for once, backed up the rhetoric. Over the past decade, China's annual launch count surged from occasional missions to dozens per year, sometimes surpassing every other country. Entire constellations for Beidou navigation, high-resolution imaging, and electronic intelligence were lofted in tight clusters, filling orbital planes in months instead of years. From the perspective of US tracking stations, it looked less like a slow, exploratory program and more like a production line. New satellites appeared, formed precise formations, and began feeding data into a tightly integrated command system on the ground. So they wondered what could cause this level of urgency on the US side. Well, there is one known source: fear of surprise in a domain that underpins everything from nuclear warning to banking timestamps. If China can field dense constellations quickly, it might also field systems to interfere with US satellites just as fast. That possibility began to reshape US behavior in very concrete ways. Budgets shifted toward resilience. Instead of a few exquisite, vulnerable spacecraft, planners funded proliferated low Earth orbit networks with hundreds of smaller nodes. War games were rewritten so that in the first hours of a crisis, Red Team China would try to dazzle imaging satellites, jam communications links, or surgically target key relays. New concepts focused on rapid reconstitution, agile launch, and constellations that could absorb damage, yet keep the signal flowing. But that raised a deeper question. If both sides now assume the other might reach for the satellites first, in the dark, silent orbits above Earth, what does that do to the stability of peace down here? And how close does it bring the world to a conflict that starts with a flicker in the data and a sudden, unexplained disruption on every screen? So, if low Earth orbit is already tense, the next arena is even more unsettling. The empty-looking space between Earth and the Moon. Engineers have a precise name for it: cislunar space, the vast volume stretching from the edge of traditional satellite orbits all the way out past the Moon's path. It is not just a big void. Threaded through it are special orbits and gravitational balance points, the so-called Lagrange points, where the pull of Earth and Moon nearly cancel. Put a satellite there, and with a little station keeping, it can sit almost motionless for years, staring down at both worlds. Militaries and space agencies have suddenly started paying close attention to this region. From high cislunar vantage points, a sensor platform can watch half the Earth's disk at once, track every launch plume, and see deep into geostationary orbit where the most valuable communications and early warning satellites live. So maybe that was it, commanders thought. Instead of fighting in crowded low orbits, move the contest out to a higher shell where surveillance platforms, refueling depots, and logistics hubs can quietly loiter. So they wondered what could cause this shift in focus to accelerate so fast. Part of the answer came from Beijing. China has announced an international lunar research station, a permanent base on the Moon's south pole planned with Russia in the 2030s. On paper, it is a science project. But they realized that explanation didn't work as a full description of the architecture. To build and supply a polar outpost, planners need stable cislunar orbits, relay satellites at Lagrange points, and way stations where cargo tugs can pause, refuel, and wait for optimal transfer windows. Chinese missions, already on the books, start to map out that future. Chang'e probes are scouting polar terrain and testing long-duration operations. Keqiao relay satellites sit near the Earth-Moon L2 point, proving that China can park hardware in those delicate gravitational wells and keep the signal flowing from the lunar far side. Each mission returns more data on the radiation environment, orbital dynamics, and communications interference patterns in cislunar space. On the other side, US-led efforts under NASA's Artemis program are racing along a parallel track. The planned Gateway station will sit in a near rectilinear halo orbit around the Moon, an odd-shaped cislunar loop that keeps it close to the South Pole for crew access, but still within easy reach of Earth. Gateway is pitched as a staging point for lunar landings and deep space missions. However, its position also makes it a powerful surveillance node, able to monitor traffic throughout the Earth-Moon system. So what was causing this new rush outward? Well, there is one known source. Whoever builds robust infrastructure in cislunar space first can shape the norms, control the key orbits, and decide who gets reliable access, which left them with just one question. If China manages to anchor itself early, with relays, depots, and patrol satellites spread across those quiet gravitational plateaus, how much would that tilt the balance of power not just on the Moon's grey regolith, but down here among the oceans, fiber cables, and missile fields of Earth? Down on Earth, that question turns into something much more familiar. Money, markets, and who owns the pipes of the digital world? Because behind the poetry of cislunar gateways, there is a very practical race underway. A space gold rush built from satellites, bandwidth, and contracts measured in decades. Start with the constellations. The most visible example is Starlink, thousands of satellites pouring down broadband. But in Chinese planning documents, Starlink is less a marvel and more a warning. Proof that whoever controls the low-orbit internet can shape entire economies. So they wondered what could cause this kind of leverage to shift. The answer was simple enough: build their own. China is now pushing several mega constellations on paper and in hardware. Guowang, a state-backed project, aims for tens of thousands of satellites to blanket the globe with broadband, integrated tightly with Beidou navigation and terrestrial 5G. Alongside it, nominally private firms, backed by provincial funds and military-civil fusion policies, propose their own Starlink-style swarms. So maybe that was it, a purely commercial rush for subscribers. But they realized that explanation didn't work. These networks are not just about selling faster video calls in rural provinces. They promise encrypted links for drones, merchant fleets, and remote mines, real-time Earth observation data for insurers and commodity traders, and in-space services such as refueling tugs and debris removal craft that can quietly nudge other satellites. Each new platform is another point where data and dependence can be routed through Beijing. Look at launch. In recent years, China has quietly become the most prolific launcher on the planet, with Long March rockets and a growing stable of commercial vehicles offering relatively low-cost rides to orbit. The target market is clear: international customers, especially developing countries already buying Chinese fiber networks, ports, and 5G towers. A small state that once leased a Chinese communications satellite can now buy a full package: spacecraft built in China, launched on a Chinese rocket, operated through Chinese ground stations. This is where control over space-based infrastructure turns into economic leverage. If one country owns the satellites, the launch pads, and the ground segment, it can offer preferential access, discount pricing, or bundled deals tied to terrestrial infrastructure loans. Or it can quietly raise prices, throttle service, or prioritize its own traffic during a crisis. So what was causing this shift in bargaining power? Well, there is one known source. Whoever owns the orbital platforms that everyone else quietly relies on. And that is the deeper point. This contest is not mainly about astronauts planting flags. It is about who will own and operate the invisible scaffolding of future digital economies. The broadband constellations, imaging fleets, navigation signals, and on-orbit service stations that keep everything running. The next section turns to a more uncomfortable angle. If those same networks can be weaponized, how hard would it be to turn a commercial lifeline into a precision tool of disruption? And if commercial networks can be turned into weapons, another question immediately appears. What happens when the biggest new space power refuses to explain what its hardware is really doing? In China's case, the mystery is not an accident. It is part of the architecture. Time after time, launch announcements from Chinese authorities follow the same pattern. A Long March rocket lifts off from Jiuquan or Xichang. State media shows a few seconds of ascent, and then a single vague sentence appears. The payload is a technology test satellite, or a remote sensing mission. No mass, no detailed orbit, no description of the instruments on board. So maybe that was it, just routine communications or weather support. But they realized that explanation didn't work. Because once those satellites are in orbit, independent tracking stations in the US and Europe can watch what they actually do. Some technology test craft repeatedly rendezvous with other objects, nudging them, towing them, or parking close enough to practice inspection. Others drift into orbits that are perfect for covering US missile fields or Pacific naval routes. Months later, Western analysts quietly update their spreadsheets. That innocuous payload turns out to be a high-resolution imaging platform, or a prototype for on-orbit servicing that also happens to look very useful for disabling an adversary's satellite. Part of the opacity comes from how fragmented the Chinese space ecosystem is. On paper, there is the civilian China National Space Administration. In practice, the real power runs through military units under the People's Liberation Army, giant state-owned contractors building rockets and sensors, and a fast-growing swarm of commercial startups. They all launch from the same pads, use similar buses, and sometimes share the same ground stations. So they wondered what could cause this confusion from the outside. The answer is that even experts struggle to assign clear responsibility or intent. That fragmentation matters. When a new remote sensing satellite appears in a near-polar orbit, is it there to monitor crops and floods, or to provide targeting data for anti-ship missiles? When an experimental Beidou navigation payload starts transmitting a slightly unusual signal, is it a benign upgrade, or a rehearsal for more sophisticated interference? Limited transparency forces everyone else to fill in the gaps with worst-case assumptions. There are concrete examples. Several Chinese satellites launched in the early 2010s were only recognized as maneuverable inspection craft after years of tracking their repeated close approaches to other objects. One pair conducted what looked very much like a refueling or capture test, long after their official mission description had faded from public view. So what was causing this behavior? Well, there is one known source: dual-use technology that can support both peaceful servicing and precise, reversible attacks in orbit. And that is the strategic point. Secrecy is not just about hiding capabilities. It is about keeping adversaries guessing, forcing them to invest in extra shielding, backup navigation, hardened receivers, and new constellations that may never be tested in anger. The uncertainty becomes its own weapon, a silent pressure on budgets and planning. which left them with just one question. If so much can be done with vague test satellites, what happens when the missions stop being tests? When missions stop being tests, something else quietly scales up instead. Consequences. And in Earth orbit, those consequences are now measured in shards of metal, flecks of paint, and dead satellites tumbling through the dark at 10 times the speed of a rifle bullet. Every launch leaves a trace. Upper stages that fail to deorbit, batteries that rupture, tanks that explode years later after their last telemetry signal. Each one adds to a growing cloud in the most valuable orbital highways. Low Earth orbit between roughly 500 and 900 kilometers is especially crowded, so even a single breakup there can seed thousands of new fragments. The physics is unforgiving. One collision can trigger more, driving a chain reaction that operators have quietly feared for decades. China's 2007 anti-satellite test is the infamous example, but it was not a one-off. Since then, Chinese rockets and satellites have produced a series of debris events that show up clearly in tracking data. In 2013, a defunct Chinese weather satellite unexpectedly fragmented, generating dozens of catalogued pieces. In 2021 and 2022, aging Chinese spacecraft shed components, adding yet more interference to already busy orbits. So they wondered what could cause this. Design flaws? Aging propellant? The official explanations were sparse, but the fragments were very real. The most controversial pattern, though, has been lower down, starting with the Long March 5B. Unlike most modern heavy rockets, its massive core stage goes all the way to orbit, then simply stays there until drag brings it down. There is no controlled deorbit burn, no targeted splashdown zone. So maybe that was it, just an acceptable risk in the rush to build the Tiangong station. But they realized that explanation didn't work. Multiple 5B cores re-entered in uncontrolled fashion over the past few years, with debris landing in West Africa, near villages in Southeast Asia, and uncomfortably close to shipping lanes. International criticism was immediate. NASA officials called the practice irresponsible. European tracking centers issued public warnings. For a few tense hours during each re-entry window, large parts of the world had to watch uncertainty maps, wondering whether a 10-story metal tank would drop into the ocean or onto a city. The probability of impact on any given house was tiny. The message about norms in orbit, however, was loud. On debris density plots, the results are hard to ignore. Look at visualizations of low Earth orbit, and dense bands of orange and red appear where operational satellites cluster. Threaded through those bands are labeled clouds from specific events. The 2007 ASAT test, later fragmentations, upper stage breakups. Many of those fragments from Chinese events now intersect with orbits used by European imaging satellites, US weather spacecraft, commercial internet constellations, and increasingly, China's own assets. That is the quiet irony. As China races to deploy new remote sensing fleets, expand Beidou navigation, and support Tiangong, its spacecraft must dodge debris fields it helped create. Collision avoidance maneuvers consume fuel and shorten mission lifetimes. Miss one conjunction alert, and an entire satellite, military or civilian, can vanish in an instant. So what was causing this? A single reckless test years ago, or a wider mindset that still treats orbit as disposable? Well, there is one known source of change in space behavior: pressure, diplomatic, economic, and increasingly military. And that raises an uncomfortable question for everyone sharing those orbits. When debris itself starts to look like a strategic lever, who decides how close to the edge to go next? And that edge gets even harder to see when the same piece of hardware can wear two faces at once. In space policy, there is a phrase that keeps coming up in classified briefings and dry technical papers: dual-use technology. On paper, it sounds harmless. In practice, it means a single satellite, a single ground station, a single stream of data can serve both civilian and military missions, often with little or no modification. Change the software, change the encryption, change the customer, and suddenly the same signal is feeding a very different battlefield. Take high-resolution Earth observation satellites. Officially, many Chinese platforms are there to help with crop monitoring, disaster relief, and urban planning. And they do. Their cameras map flood zones, track drought, and measure harvests. But the exact same images can reveal tank parks, missile transporter routes, or the construction pattern of a new radar site. Zoom in on a rice field, or zoom in on an airbase. The satellite does not care. The same story plays out with communications. A relay in geostationary orbit might beam TV dramas and weather channels to millions of homes. So maybe that was it, a harmless broadcast system. But with reserved transponders and different modulation, that same satellite can carry encrypted command links to warships, drones, or missile units. No new launch, no new hardware, just a quiet reconfiguration of who gets priority on the network. So what was causing this blurring in China's case? On paper, many spacecraft are branded as civilian. Environmental monitoring, scientific research, experimental communications. However, the operators listed in technical filings often trace back to entities with direct ties to the People's Liberation Army or the state defense industry. An aerospace science and technology corporation might sound neutral until the ownership chart shows its role in missile development and military electronics. That dual-use nature creates a convenient shield. Chinese officials can point to disaster relief images or broadband coverage maps and insist that the program is peaceful. And there is genuine civilian benefit in those data streams, which makes the claim hard to dismiss. But they realized that explanation didn't work for everyone watching from the outside, because the same infrastructure also improves targeting, navigation, and secure command in any future conflict. For foreign analysts, that raises a sharp question. When almost every satellite can be a sensor or a weapon enabler, what exactly counts as a legitimate military target in orbit? In a crisis, an Earth observation craft guiding emergency responders today could be retasked to track troop movements tomorrow. A communications satellite carrying telemedicine 1 hour could be coordinating air defenses the next. And that leads to an unsettling implication. If one side starts attacking civilian satellites that quietly feed military systems, the other may see it as a strike on its critical infrastructure and escalate in response. The line between nuisance interference and strategic attack blurs, which left them with just one question. In the next serious confrontation, does the first shot in space arrive long before anyone admits the war has started? And while everyone is still arguing about what counts as an attack in space, something else is happening much more quietly. The planet is being photographed. Constantly. In 2024, Chinese Earth observation satellites could routinely resolve objects down to about half a meter from hundreds of kilometers up. That means a single pixel can be a car. A slightly bigger blur might be an aircraft on a runway. Line up several images over months and subtle changes in infrastructure. New fuel tanks, a lengthened pier, a freshly poured missile silo, suddenly stand out as clearly as a red pen on tracing paper. So they wondered what could cause this level of detail to become strategically decisive. The answer was not one satellite, but many. China has been building constellations, high-resolution optical images in sun-synchronous orbits, radar satellites that can see through clouds and at night, and even small commercial craft whose data can be quietly bought or steered. One pass over a naval base is useful, 10 passes a day, every day, begin to look a lot more like real-time surveillance. Look at what that means for a place such as Guam or a US carrier strike group in the Western Pacific. Analysts have pointed to Chinese satellites repeatedly imaging carrier formations, tracking their movement across oceans. So maybe that was it, just routine intelligence gathering. But they realized that explanation didn't work. The pattern in the data hinted at something more integrated. Imagery feeding into targeting models, simulations and war games that test how quickly missiles could be cued on a moving ship. Well, there is one known source that can tie all of this together. A fused picture from imaging satellites, electronic intelligence receivers, and navigation systems such as behaviour, all piped into command centers on the ground. From there, the same map that helps a farmer plan irrigation can, with different software, update firing solutions on anti-ship ballistic missiles. The pixels do not care what they are used for. However, the story is not only about war. The very same Chinese imaging networks are also pointed at cities after earthquakes, river basins during floods, and smog-filled industrial regions. High-resolution data helps planners design new subway lines in Chengdu, monitor illegal sand mining on the Yangtze, or track desertification in Inner Mongolia. Those civilian benefits make it much easier to justify more launches, more sensors, more coverage. So what was causing this blurring of boundaries between helpful mapping and potential targeting? The technology itself. Dual use by design. While you sleep, a radar satellite might be measuring soil moisture over your region, while an optical one logs the number of aircraft on a distant runway. And somewhere above you, right now, multiple satellites, Chinese, American, Russian, European, are quietly refreshing a global machine-readable map of human activity. The question is not whether they see. The question is, in the next crisis, who decides what those images are used for first? And if those images can be steered, there is something else that can be steered too. The machines taking them. Because at a technical level, a satellite is not a mystical object. It is a specialized computer with solar panels and a radio. It runs software. It processes data. It talks to ground stations over networks. So they wondered what could cause this new anxiety among planners. It was the realization that the same vulnerabilities that haunt laptops and routers now extend all the way into orbit. Think about a typical Chinese Earth observation or beidou navigation satellite. Commands go up, telemetry comes down, all wrapped in radio signals that are scheduled, logged, and on paper, secured. But if an attacker can get into that command chain or into the ground station that feeds it, the satellite becomes just another node on a compromised network. So maybe that was it. The quiet shift from worrying about missiles to worrying about malware. Public assessments from US and allied agencies have been blunt. They describe China investing heavily in offensive cyber tools aimed at space infrastructure, intrusion sets tailored for satellite control software, campaigns mapping foreign ground stations, and capabilities to tamper with the data links that tie everything together. None of this needs a dramatic launch. It just needs a foothold in the right server rack. So what was causing this new category of threat to feel so pressing? Consider a few plausible scenarios. One is hijacking. An operator sends what appears to be a routine maneuver command, but it has been altered in transit, nudging a satellite a fraction of a degree off its intended path. Nothing explodes. Insurance barely twitches. Yet months later, its coverage over a region of interest is mysteriously worse. Another is data manipulation. A reconnaissance satellite downlinks imagery through an overseas ground station. Somewhere in that chain, malicious code subtly shifts timestamps or geolocation tags. The pixels look fine, the signal is clean, but the map they feed becomes quietly, systematically wrong. In a crisis, that could mean a convoy that appears to be 20 kilometers away is actually much closer. And then there is reversible interference. A powerful uplink transmits carefully crafted noise into a satellite's receiver, or a spoofed navigation signal overwhelms the real one. For a few minutes, ships, drones, or missiles see a skewed Beidou solution. Then everything snaps back to normal, leaving only a puzzling blip in the logs. But they realized that explanation didn't work for people who still assumed that only kinetic attacks mattered. Cyber operations have advantages that rockets do not. They are cheaper. They are deniable. And crucially, they can be calibrated to stay below the threshold of open conflict. Well, there is one known source of temptation when the global economy depends on space-based timing, imaging, and communications. The incentive to probe every digital weak point grows with each new satellite launched, which left them with just one question. If the next major disruption does not come from a visible explosion in orbit, how will anyone even know who pulled the trigger and from where? So if the next disruption is hard to trace, there is an even stranger possibility to consider. What if in a few years, it only affects half the planet's infrastructure at a time? Right now, navigation, communications, and Earth observation are quietly splitting into overlapping but distinct constellations. On one side, GPS, Starlink, and fleets of US and European imaging satellites. On the other, China's Beidou navigation system, its growing broadband constellations, and high-resolution Gaofen and Yaogan imaging satellites. To a user on the ground, it all feels seamless. The phone locks on. The map loads. The video call works. But the underlying pattern is changing. Take navigation. Since 2020, Beidou has provided global coverage, giving Beijing an independent timing and positioning backbone. So maybe that was it. A simple redundancy story. More satellites, more resilience. But they realized that explanation didn't work. The signals are encoded differently. The ground control is separate, and the security services that rely on them are not sharing operational data. A Chinese missile battery will be tuned to Beidou. A US destroyer will be tuned to GPS and allied systems. In a crisis, those are not interchangeable. The same split is emerging in communications. Imagine a country deciding which space internet to plug into. One scenario, it signs deals with US-based operators, builds ground stations compatible with Western standards, and aligns its cybersecurity rules with NATO partners. Another, it hosts Chinese tracking stations, uses Beidou reference time for its power grid, and lets Chinese-built satellite terminals handle government traffic. The hardware on the roof quietly declares an alliance. So, what was causing this? Sanctions and export controls are accelerating the divergence. After the US restricted high-end chips and satellite components to China, Beijing doubled down on indigenous designs and regional partners. Western regulators in turn began questioning Chinese ground stations in places from South America to the Arctic, worried about data exfiltration and interference. Each security fear closes one door to shared infrastructure and opens another to parallel systems. The risk is not just two separate maps of the sky, it is interoperability gaps on the ground. A tractor guidance unit that works flawlessly with GPS might get degraded performance with Beidou in certain modes. A smartphone chipset might quietly prioritize one constellation's signal over another. Payment networks, stock exchanges, and power grids could find that their timing receivers prefer one standard, creating subtle dependencies that function as invisible spheres of influence. Well, There is one known source of leverage when infrastructure fragments. Whoever controls the default settings controls behavior. If a future disruption in one constellation suddenly knocks out timing in a block of countries, does the other side even notice? Or does it keep running, creating two realities in the same moment? Which leaves a larger question hanging over every new launch. Is the world drifting toward parallel, competing space internets, where a passport does not just determine which borders someone can cross, but which satellites their devices are allowed to talk to? So if space is splitting into parallel networks, whose rules apply in between them? On paper, the answer looks straightforward. In reality, it is anything but. The backbone of space law is still a document from the Cold War, the 1967 Outer Space Treaty. It does a few very clear things. It bans weapons of mass destruction in orbit or on celestial bodies. It says outer space is the province of all mankind, not a place any country can claim as territory. And it makes states internationally responsible for their satellites, even if a private company is flying them. But when it comes to conventional weapons, electronic warfare, or dual-use systems, the text falls almost silent. So they wondered what could cause this gap to matter. Look at anti-satellite weapons. There is no comprehensive treaty that bans them. No global ban on blowing up someone else's satellite, or dazzling its sensors, or nudging it off course. Instead, there are voluntary guidelines, UN resolutions with careful wording, and political statements about responsible behavior. Useful signals of intent, yes, but with very limited enforcement power when a crisis hits. China has learned to operate inside that ambiguity. Publicly, Beijing backs initiatives with reassuring names. Preventing an arms race in outer space. No first placement of weapons in outer space. Diplomats repeat that space should remain peaceful. So maybe that was it, a genuine commitment to restraint. But they realized that explanation didn't work once the hardware was examined. In 2007, China used a missile to destroy one of its own weather satellites, scattering thousands of debris fragments that still threaten spacecraft today. Since then, Chinese launch data and tracking from independent stations show a steady expansion of capabilities that could, in a crisis, threaten other nations' systems. Ground-based lasers that can blind imaging satellites, maneuverable inspection craft that can sidle up to another spacecraft, and jammers that can drown out GPS or Beidou signals over a region. This is where the gray zones begin. A satellite performing proximity operations can be marketed as an on-orbit servicing test or a debris removal demo. The same maneuver, flown a little closer, can look like a rehearsal for grabbing or disabling an adversary's asset. Radio interference can be dismissed as a malfunctioning transmitter. Cyber intrusions on a ground control network leave even less debris, but far more questions. Well, there is one known source of discipline in this environment: reputation. States still fear being blamed for reckless behavior that creates visible debris clouds. But in domains that leave no obvious plume, no instant trail of fragments on tracking radar, the incentives tilt toward experimentation. The legal and normative vacuum in space gives every major power, including China, room to probe the edges without crossing the single bright red line the treaty actually drew. No nukes in orbit. So what was causing this new pattern of disruptions and suspicious maneuvers? Deliberate tests, careless engineering, or quiet signaling between rivals? The answer may depend less on written law and more on what one country decided to launch next. For outside analysts, that meant turning their attention to one country in particular: China. On paper, Beijing insists its rise in space is peaceful. In practice, the signals coming from its bureaucracy tell a far more complicated story. At the surface, there is a familiar face: the China National Space Administration, or CNSA. It looks at first glance a lot like NASA. It announces lunar landings, shows glossy animations of the Tiangong space station, and talks about a future research base on the moon. So maybe that was it, a civilian agency running a normal exploration program, just with Chinese characteristics. But they realized that explanation didn't work, because behind CNSA sits a second, much quieter pillar: the People's Liberation Army Strategic Support Force. This is the branch that treats space, cyber and electronic warfare as one continuous battle space. When a new Beidou navigation satellite goes up, or a high-resolution imaging satellite appears in orbit, the question is not just what it does, but who actually controls the uplink, the tasking orders, and the encryption keys. This is where a core doctrine comes in: civil-military fusion. In Chinese policy, there is no clean firewall between civilian and military projects. The same launch pads that send up weather satellites can, on another day, loft an experimental anti-satellite interceptor. The same tracking stations that support Tiangong can feed targeting data to the PLA. So they wondered what could cause this kind of tight coupling to become so pervasive. Well, there is one known source: the state-owned giants that build almost everything that flies. The China Aerospace Science and Technology Corporation, CASC, makes the Long March rockets and many of the big national satellites. Its cousin, CASIC, focuses more on missiles, space weapons research, and what officials carefully call defense applications. On organizational charts, they are commercial contractors. In practice, their boards answer to the same party committees that oversee the military. Then there are the startups. Names that appear in investor decks as private launch firms or small satellite operators often share office parks, engineers, or patents with CASC academies or PLA research institutes. A company might advertise broadband internet, but its first real customer is a provincial military district. To an outside observer, the interference between public branding and actual command chains can be hard to resolve. This structure has a clear effect. It lets China move very fast on ambitious projects. Beidou reached global coverage in 2020. Tiangong went from concept to permanent crewed station while the ISS approached retirement, and new constellations are being stacked into orbit at a pace that now rivals any other country. However, strategic control stays highly centralized, and that raises a different pattern of concern abroad. When a new Chinese satellite appears near a foreign asset, foreign militaries are not just reading its official mission label. They are asking who built it, who paid for it, and whose orders it will follow in a crisis, which left them with just one question: what happens when that blurred chain of command meets a real orbital confrontation? That looming question does not stop at geostationary orbit. It extends much farther out, to places where there are no traffic rules at all yet: the Moon and Mars. In January 2019, China did something no one else had managed. The Chang'e 4 spacecraft touched down on the far side of the Moon, a region permanently hidden from Earth. From the surface, its rover sent back images and scientific data, but the real achievement was invisible. A relay satellite parked beyond the Moon, catching every signal and bouncing it home. So they wondered what could cause this level of precision on the far side. The answer was a tightly choreographed deep space network. Then came Chang'e 5 in 2020. It landed on the near side, drilled into ancient lunar regolith, launched a small ascent vehicle back into orbit, performed an automated rendezvous and docking, and returned samples to Inner Mongolia. On paper, it was a scientific mission. In practice, it was a full demonstration of long-range navigation, autonomous proximity operations, and high-energy re-entry. Those are the same families of technologies that guide intercontinental missiles, stealthy inspector satellites, and high-speed hypersonic gliders. Mars raised the stakes again. Tianwen-1 did not just fly by or orbit. It arrived in 2021 with an orbiter, a lander, and the Zhurong rover, all in one shot. No test flyby, no separate launch window. So maybe that was it, a bold scientific gamble that happened to pay off. But they realized that explanation didn't work. The pattern across Chang'e and Tianwen missions pointed to something else. A deliberate effort to master complex, multi-element campaigns in deep space, where communication delays and narrow launch windows punish any mistake. Those capabilities matter because of where China intends to go next. Beijing and Moscow have announced plans for an international lunar research station in the 2030s, potentially near the Moon's south pole. That region is not just photogenic. Craters there may trap water ice, hydrogen, and other volatiles in permanent shadow, while nearby ridges offer near-constant sunlight. In other words, power on the hilltops, resources in the valleys. Space agencies talk about this in gentle terms: in situ resource utilization, oxygen from regolith, propellant from ice. But under the surface is a harder strategic question. If one country or partnership learns to mine lunar soil, refine metals, and store fuel in orbit before others, it gains leverage over who can afford to operate in deep space at all. Well, there is one known source of long-term advantage in any frontier: control of infrastructure. So what was causing this rush to plant not just flags but hardware on the Moon? For rivals, the concern is clear. Whoever builds the first permanent depots, habitats and relay stations in cislunar space will have a strong claim when the world finally sits down to write the rules, which left them with just one question: whose law will govern the next century of activity beyond Earth orbit? But before any treaty conference in some future lunar court, the first real test of those rules would not happen on the Moon. It would happen in the most mundane place imaginable: your commute, your supermarket, your local airport. Imagine a regional crisis in the Western Pacific. Tensions spike around a disputed island chain. Warships crowd the sea lanes. In the background, something quieter happens. Aircraft flying through the area begin reporting strange navigation glitches. Shipping captains see their tankers suddenly jump dozens of kilometers on their electronic charts. So they wondered what could cause this. On the surface, the weather is fine. The hardware is working. But the pattern in the data tells a different story. GNSS signals over the region are being jammed and spoofed. Receivers are flooded with powerful interference from an unknown source, while fake timing and position data are injected into the band. Well, there is one known source that can affect such a wide area without anyone seeing an antenna: satellites. At first, it stays local. Flights are rerouted around the hotspot. Container ships slow down or anchor offshore until their navigation stabilizes. So maybe that was it. Just a temporary disruption in a faraway conflict zone. But they realized that explanation didn't work. Because navigation satellites do more than draw a blue dot on a map. Every GNSS constellation, from GPS to China's Beidou, is a global timing grid. Those signals choreograph financial markets, ATM networks, and the backbone of the internet. Stock exchanges use them to timestamp trades down to the microsecond. Cellular base stations use them to keep towers in perfect sync so that calls hand off cleanly as people move. When that timing slips, even by a tiny margin, the effects are weirdly visible. Ride-sharing apps stop finding drivers, contactless payments fail, and ATMs quietly go offline. Now scale the crisis. A key transshipment port, one that handles a large fraction of Asia-Europe trade, loses reliable satellite data for days. Cranes cannot safely align containers because their differential GNSS feeds are full of noise. Automated yards revert to manual mode. Ships stack up outside the harbor. Within a week, factories in Europe run short of critical components. Supermarkets on the other side of the world start to see empty shelves, where certain imports used to be. The disruption began with a regional signal war, but the economic shock travels globally. Complicating this further, many receivers today blend GPS, Beidou, Galileo, and GLONASS for resilience. In theory, that redundancy should help. In practice, a conflict involving China could turn that diversity into a vulnerability if interference targets specific combinations of signals, or if certain constellations are switched off or degraded for military reasons. So what was causing this hypothetical mess in everyday life? Not a science fiction laser battle in orbit, but subtle changes in invisible timing pulses. The first sign might not be a headline about anti-satellite tests. It might be planes grounded at your local airport, a payment declined at a busy store, or a navigation app that suddenly insists you are in the middle of the ocean. And if that sounds abstract, the next question is even sharper. How would anyone actually detect that such a space conflict had begun in time to respond? In a sense, that is the real nightmare. The war has already started, but it only shows up as technical issues and delayed flights. Because so far, there has never been a full-scale shooting war in space. No dogfights between spacecraft, no lasers carving up solar panels on live TV. But in classified rooms in Beijing, Washington, and Moscow, militaries run detailed war games of exactly those scenarios. Look at how those games usually begin, not with missiles, but with interference. The first rung on the escalation ladder is reversible, jamming the radio link between a satellite and its users, dazzling an optical sensor with a ground-based laser so it sees only white. So maybe that was it. A brief, deniable disruption that can be switched off the moment diplomats start asking questions. Then the model steps up a level, cyber. Instead of burning out a satellite, an attacker quietly slips into its control network. Commands are delayed, data is corrupted, images arrive with just enough distortion to mislead a targeting system. So they wondered what could cause this. A glitch? A solar flare? But they realized that explanation didn't work. The pattern in the data looks intentional, targeted, and in many simulations, it points to one main actor, China. Chinese military planners study the same vulnerability maps as their US counterparts. They know American forces lean heavily on GPS, on secure communications satellites, on early warning spacecraft that watch for missile launches. So what was causing this? In most expert scenarios, those are the first high-value targets on both sides. Knockout navigation in one region and aircraft are suddenly unsure of their exact position. Blind and early warning satellite and commanders start to wonder if something is being hidden behind the static. However, smashing everything in orbit would be self-defeating. Debris does not care whose flag is painted on a rocket, so Chinese concepts often focus on something narrower, blinding US forces in a specific theater while preserving global services. That might mean regional jamming of GPS over the Western Pacific, precise interference with a handful of American relay satellites, and cyber intrusions that quietly feed false timing data into foreign systems, all while Beidou navigation and commercial links appear to function normally elsewhere. Well, there is one known source of leverage that makes this especially tempting: China's own independent Beidou network. In a crisis, Chinese units could keep accurate positioning from Beidou while degrading GPS in a combat zone. From the outside, civilian users might only notice that their phones are a bit off, that drones drift, that a few airports switch to backup procedures, which left them with just one question. Does the fear of that invisible escalation ladder push governments toward new rules and restraint in orbit, or toward preemptive, destabilizing moves to strike first, before the other side reaches for the switch? For all that, the story in orbit is not just a slow-motion arms race. There is another, quieter pattern in the data. Places where China and the rest of the world still plug into the same systems, share the same signals, and at least for now, need each other. Start with Tiangong. While the US has effectively sealed off NASA from direct cooperation, European and other international partners have been slipping experiments onto Chinese missions. European-developed detectors have flown to study cosmic rays, combustion, and fluid physics in microgravity. Pakistani and Ethiopian payloads have hitched rides on Chinese rockets. So maybe that was it, a hint that even in a fractured landscape, scientists will keep finding side doors. The same thing shows up on the ground, in the shared data streams that never make headlines. China participates in several global networks for space weather monitoring, for tracking charged particles and solar storms that can fry satellites and knock out power grids. It contributes to debris catalogs and disaster monitoring constellations, feeding imagery and radar measurements into international systems that warn of floods, fires, and typhoons. So they wondered what could cause this. A government that tests anti-satellite weapons, but also sends its stations' readings into joint warning centers. But they realized that explanation didn't work. The contradiction is the point. The same infrastructure that can blind an adversary can also save coastal cities when a cyclone spins up. Then, there is the developing world. From South America to Africa to Southeast Asia, ministries that could never afford a domestic launch sector are quietly signing contracts in Beijing. Chinese Long March rockets put their first satellites into orbit. Beidou ground stations and timing receivers appear at ports, in telecom networks, on new highways. For those governments, Chinese launch services and navigation infrastructure are not an abstract geopolitical threat. They are the cheapest ticket into the space age, an alternative to depending entirely on GPS and Western operators. A more exotic bridge runs through quantum physics. In 2017, China's Mikyus satellite established ultra-secure quantum communication links between ground stations in China and Europe, sending entangled photons across thousands of kilometers. That experiment needed European telescopes, Chinese optics, and extremely patient engineers on both ends of the link. Well, there is one known source of trust in this domain: shared, hard-to-fake demonstrations that the underlying physics works for everyone. All of this points to a narrow but real channel for diplomacy. No one benefits if low Earth orbit fills with shrapnel or if navigation signals become untrustworthy. Commercial insurers, cargo companies, and disaster response teams do not care whose flag is painted on the satellite, only that the interference stays within bounds and the warning comes on time. So what was causing this uneasy coexistence, where rivals still swap tracking data and co-author papers? The answer matters, because the next phase of the story moves farther out, to the moon and beyond, where those incentives to cooperate start to thin out, and the prizes get much bigger. So if low Earth orbit is an uneasy truce, the next question is obvious. Is the US-China race beyond that already a new space Cold War? On paper, the resemblance is unsettling. Two superpowers, competing systems, prestige missions, and a steady drumbeat of military signaling. During the US-Soviet era, the contest was framed as freedom versus communism, and every launch carried ideological weight. Today, Washington calls China its pacing threat in space, while Beijing warns that US Space Force plans are destabilizing. The rhetoric feels familiar. However, the economies underneath it are welded together. Supply chains, rare earths, consumer tech, even some satellite components still cross borders. That deep interdependence makes any clean Cold War analogy wobble. Look at the concrete indicators. One side anchors the International Space Station. The other runs Tiangong, a completely separate outpost with its own crews, experiments, and partners. GPS and Beidou now provide parallel global navigation signals, each giving its military an independent positioning backbone. Artemis lays out a US-led path to the moon, while China and Russia promote an international lunar research station on a different timetable and with different rules. At the same time, both accuse the other of quietly rehearsing for war in orbit. ASAT tests, close approach maneuvers, inspector satellites that drift a little too near, and ground stations probing for cyber weak points. So they wondered what could cause this pattern of almost mirrored capabilities. Well, there is one known source in geopolitics: mutual suspicion. When one side deploys a missile tracking satellite, the other sees a potential targeting system. When one launches a mega constellation to beam internet, the other sees a resilient command network that is hard to shut down. So maybe that was it, until analysts noticed something the Cold War never had. This time, commercial actors are everywhere. SpaceX, OneWeb, Chinese broadband constellations, private radar imaging fleets. They pour out signals and data that militaries can tap. Dozens of nations now fly their own satellites. Cyber units can reach straight into a spacecraft's control systems from a laptop continents away. A single intrusion, not a missile, might be the first shot. But they realized that explanation didn't work on its own, because it downplays how language shapes behavior. Some experts warn that calling this a space Cold War is not just description, it is interference. Label the other side an inevitable adversary and every ambiguous maneuver becomes hostile by default. Treat cooperation as naive, and joint projects quietly die. The frame can harden into policy. So what was causing this shift from uneasy coexistence to talk of a new standoff? And for viewers, that raises a harder question. Is sharp competition in orbit an inevitable, even healthy driver of innovation, or a dangerous spiral that makes the signals every society depends on more fragile? The next step is to see what happens when that rivalry moves to the lunar surface, where the prizes and the risks get much larger. So if rivalry in orbit is sharpening, the next question is obvious. How do states stop one bad day in space from turning into a catastrophe on the ground? In the last few years, the answer has quietly shifted from hoping nothing breaks to assuming something will, and designing the system so it survives anyway. The most visible change is overhead. For decades, critical missions relied on a handful of big, exquisite satellites. Lose one, and an entire region might lose communications or navigation. Now the trend is the opposite: proliferated constellations. Hundreds or thousands of small spacecraft spread across multiple orbital planes. Starlink, OneWeb, and China's own planned broadband mega-constellations are all part of this pattern. So maybe that was it, a purely commercial move for faster internet. But they realized that explanation didn't work. Militaries saw another advantage. It is far harder for any adversary, including China, to knock out a service when the target is a swarm. In effect, this turns space infrastructure into something closer to a mesh network than a fragile totem pole. Take out a few nodes, and the signal routes around the damage. The US Space Development Agency's new transport and missile tracking layers are built on exactly that idea. Chinese planners are watching and responding with their own dense constellations. So what was causing this shift is not just technology, but deterrence. The message that a surprise strike would be painful, yet not decisive. On Earth, resilience means assuming that GPS or Beidou might fail at the worst possible moment. So they wondered what could cause this dependence to be less dangerous. The answer is backup timing and navigation. Some countries are reviving ELORAN, a low-frequency terrestrial system whose signals are strong enough to punch through jamming and even some urban canyons. Others are building fiber-based timing networks that distribute ultra-precise clock signals through buried cables to banks, power grids, and telecom hubs. Receivers themselves are changing too. Multi-GNSS chips can listen to GPS, Beidou, Galileo, and GLONASS at once, switching between them when interference or spoofing hits one constellation. That diversity has a quiet implication. Even if one provider is under attack, the disruption does not automatically cascade into global chaos. Higher up, another layer of protection is simply knowing what is where. International efforts to improve space situational awareness now fuse radar, optical telescopes, and even commercial tracking data to follow hundreds of thousands of objects. The aim is not just to dodge debris, but to spot unusual maneuvers early enough that an inspector satellite is not misread as an attacker. Here, norms matter. Voluntary debris mitigation guidelines, pre-launch notifications, and alerts about close approaches are becoming the minimum standard. Well, there is one known source of tension: how consistently major powers, including China, follow those norms. Every missed notification or unexplained maneuver shows up in the data and fuels suspicion. The picture is not comforting, but it is not hopeless. The risks are real, yet so is the global push to harden space infrastructure and build in graceful failure. That resilience buys something precious: time, a buffer in which diplomacy, new rules, and the next section of this story can try to catch up with the hardware already in orbit. That buffer of time is narrow, and it brings the story back to where it began. A single satellite that quietly vanished from public tracking, then appeared again in a different orbit with no official explanation. That small mystery pulled on a thread, and following that thread revealed something much larger than one stealthy maneuver. Look at what the data forced into view: repeated patterns of hardware that can do two things at once. A robotic arm that can service a satellite, or grab one. A relay platform that can boost communications, or relay targeting data. So they wondered what could cause this steady convergence of civilian promise and military potential. So maybe that was it, a coincidence of technology maturing at the same time everywhere. But they realized that explanation didn't work. Because in China's case, the pieces line up too neatly. Beidou reached global coverage in 2020, giving Beijing its own navigation signal, independent of GPS, resilient against foreign interference. Tiangong went from mock-ups to a permanently crewed station that can operate for a decade or more, completely outside the ISS framework. On the ground, launch pads that once hosted a handful of rockets now support more annual launches than any other country. This is not a side project. Taken together, the conclusion is hard to avoid. China is building a comprehensive space ecosystem that does not rely on anyone else. It is scientific, with experiments on Tiangong and lunar sample returns. It is commercial, with satellite internet proposals and remote sensing constellations sold to foreign customers. And it is unmistakably military, with anti-satellite tests in 2007 that sprayed long-lived debris through orbit, co-orbital inspectors, and doctrinal papers that treat space as a warfighting domain. However, this is not a cartoon villain story. Many of these missions are genuine contributions: high-resolution Earth imagery that helps with disaster response, lunar geology that adds to human knowledge, cheap launches that lower costs for everyone who can access them. Engineers on Tiangong running fluid physics experiments are not plotting a laser cannon. They are doing science in microgravity, the same way their peers do on the ISS. The risks come less from any single satellite and more from the way the whole system is being built. Secrecy around military payloads makes it hard to distinguish a repair mission from an attack. Debris from past tests still drifts through busy orbits, a constant background hazard. Dual-use ambiguity means a maneuver can be read as calibration or preparation. In a crisis, that ambiguity can turn into miscalculation, especially if navigation or early warning satellites suddenly experience interference or go dark. So what was causing this? In that scenario, the answer might arrive too late. The next time the night sky comes into view, it is no longer just a quiet backdrop for stars. It is infrastructure, navigation signals, broadband links, missile warning sensors, all layered over each other. China is now a central source of that infrastructure, whether other countries welcome it or not. And that leaves the world with a new question. How do you share an orbital neighborhood when every satellite might be both a service and a weapon? So when orbit turns into a neighborhood, the next question is awkward. Who gets a say in how the neighbors behave? In democracies, that answer does not just come from classified briefings or quiet military memos. It comes from public pressure, elections, and the stories people accept about what China is doing in space. If voters are convinced that every Chinese satellite is a weapon, policy will tilt one way. If they are told it is all peaceful science, it may tilt the other. Reality sits in between, but the political system responds to whichever signal is loudest. So they wondered what could cause this swing between cooperation and confrontation. Part of it is narrative. China points to Tiangong's experiments and Beidou's civilian services. Western officials point to the 2007 anti-satellite test, to robotic inspector satellites that maneuver close to others, to military writings that call space a warfighting domain. So maybe that was it, a simple good program versus bad program story. But they realized that explanation didn't work. The same launch that carries a climate satellite can also test rendezvous techniques useful for disabling another nation's spacecraft. For viewers, that dual-use pattern means one thing. Do not accept simple labels. When a headline says China builds peaceful lunar base, ask what communications, navigation, and surveillance infrastructure will sit behind it. When a commentator declares that China's space program is purely aggressive, ask for data. Which satellite? What orbit? What behavior? Who measured the interference or the maneuver? There are concrete ways to stay grounded in evidence. Public space situational awareness dashboards now show real-time tracks for thousands of objects. Some even flag close approaches and unusual burns. Independent analysts publish open reports on Chinese launches, military doctrines, and debris events. Even the phone in a pocket can be a reminder. Many devices already use Beidou alongside GPS and Galileo. Settings menus quietly reveal that personal navigation is tied into this geopolitical contest. The stakes are not abstract. Standards set now for navigation signals, satellite-to-satellite links, and safety zones around space stations will decide whether orbit stays interoperable or fractures into rival blocks. A world where Chinese and Western systems cannot talk to each other is not just inconvenient. In a crisis, incompatible protocols and missing data can turn a misunderstanding into a collision. So what was causing this emerging fork in the road? Public choices, made one debate at a time. Viewers are already part of that. In comments, in conversations, in votes, people will nudge their governments toward competing, cooperating, or trying to do both under strict rules. The next section will ask directly, which path should their own country take with China in space? And what happens if that choice is wrong? So now the fork in the road is no longer abstract. China has Beidou covering the planet, Tiangong circling overhead, anti-satellite tests in its past, and cislunar ambitions on the table. The signals are already in the air. The only open question is how the rest of the world chooses to respond to them. Because that tension runs through every orbit China touches. The same Beidou constellation that lets a farmer in Sichuan steer a tractor within centimeters also lets a missile battery operate if GPS goes dark. The same Tiangong modules that host protein crystal experiments could, in a different political climate, become a staging point for more aggressive surveillance. So maybe that was it, a purely peaceful rise. But they realized that explanation didn't work. From this point on, the story is not just written in launch manifests and orbital data. It is written in public expectations. So viewers are asked directly, when they look at China's rise in space, do they see an opportunity for collaboration, a threat that has to be contained, or a more uncomfortable mix that demands strict rules and constant verification? Which of those feels closest to the truth? And which one do they want their own country to prepare for? In the comments, that abstract dilemma can turn into something concrete. Which part of this emerging infrastructure raises the biggest question for them? Beidou's role as a backup if GPS suffers another mysterious disruption, Tiangong's future once the ISS retires, the quiet testing of anti-satellite weapons, or those plans to move into cislunar space and maybe control the high ground around the moon. So what was causing this concern for them personally? They are invited to ask for detail. If something in the data felt unfinished, this is the place to say so. How exactly does a Beidou signal differ from GPS at the receiver? Could an anti-satellite test in low orbit trigger a chain reaction of debris? Well, there is one known source of clarity: specific questions. Viewers can drop them below, and the next investigations can lock onto those coordinates. There is also a quiet suggestion. Share this with someone who still thinks space is just rockets and astronauts waving at cameras. The pattern in this episode has been different. The focus has been on the invisible infrastructure under banking, shipping, power grids, and warfare. If a friend relies on a phone map, a stock trade, or a flight path, they are already inside this story, whether they notice the interference or not. For anyone who wants to keep following the signals, the next step is ready. The playlist on GPS disruptions goes deeper into how a single satellite can scramble navigation over a continent. Another episode tracks the growing cloud of space debris and asks how many more tests or accidents the orbits above can survive. A third looks at the future of satellite internet and what happens if rival constellations begin to compete or collide in low Earth orbit. The orbit humanity builds around Earth in the next decade will either stabilize the system or make it dangerously fragile. Viewers are already inside that decision. Before they look away, they can choose what to watch next, what to ask next, and which path they want their own country to take, while there is still time to change course.